Robbers Cave, Oklahoma, June 1954. 22 boys climb out of two separate buses and walk into a state park they have never seen before, assigned to cabins half a mile apart, with no knowledge that the other group exists. They are 11 years old. They are healthy, well-adjusted, from stable two-parent homes. They were selected specifically because psychological screening showed no signs of aggression, no history of behavioral problems, no predisposition toward conflict. The researchers chose the most normal boys they could find. They needed to know what normal boys would do. Within 3 days, they were threatening to kill each other. The question this raises is not whether children can be made hostile under the right conditions. The question is what those conditions actually are, how simple they turn out to be, how little it takes, and what it means that the same mechanism operating in a state park in Oklahoma in 1954 is operating in every workplace, every political system, every neighborhood. Every family where two groups have been made to see each other as separate. The findings from Robbers Cave did not stay in the academic literature. They became a blueprint. Some of the people who study them most carefully were not psychologists. And it is exactly these questions, the structural ones, the ones that explain what you see when you look at the world, that the human code was made to answer. Muzafer Sharif was 51 years old in 1954 and had already run 2 versions of this experiment that had gone wrong. The first, in 1949, had collapsed because the boys figured out they were being studied and began performing for the researchers. The second, in 1953, had been shut down early when the hostility between groups escalated faster than the team could manage and parents had to be called. Sharif did not publish either study. He recalibrated and tried again. What makes him worth understanding as a person before we get to what he discovered is that he was not a detached academic theorist. He was a Turkish immigrant who had watched the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the violence of nationalist movements, the speed with which ordinary people organized themselves into groups that regarded outsiders as enemies. He was not studying intergroup conflict from a position of intellectual curiosity. He was trying to understand something that had shaped his entire life, something he believed he could reduce to its components if he could only find a clean enough laboratory. A summer camp in the San Juan Mountains of Oklahoma was his laboratory. The boys had been selected months in advance, their backgrounds checked, their psychological profiles assessed. They were all white, all Protestant, all from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, variables controlled so that any conflict that emerged could not be attributed to pre-existing difference. The staff were all researchers in disguise. Every conversation was monitored. Every interaction was recorded. The camp had a name, like a real camp. The boys thought they were on a normal summer vacation. Phase 1 lasted 1 week. The two groups, who had named themselves the Eagles and the Rattlers, lived separately, hiked separately, ate separately, and developed internal identities with no knowledge of each other's existence. They established hierarchies. They developed nicknames and rituals. They claimed territory. By the end of the first week, each group had the cohesion and internal loyalty of a unit that had been together for months. Then Sharif introduced contact. The Eagles and the Rattlers were told, for the first time, that there was another group at the camp. And here is the finding that stopped Sharif, and that has never entirely been explained away. The hostility began before any competition was introduced, before any conflict of interest, before anyone had taken anything from anyone or blocked anyone's access to any resource. Simply learning that there was another group, a group that had been using the same spaces, the same equipment, the same trails, produced immediate territorial language. The boys began referring to the other group with dismissive names within hours of learning they existed. This is important because it dismantles the assumption that intergroup conflict requires a reason. It requires only a boundary. The competition phase began in the second week. Sharif's team designed a tournament, baseball, tug-of-war, tent pitching, a treasure hunt, in which only one group could win the prize, a trophy, individual medals, and penknives. Zero-sum by design. What followed across the next 5 days was documented in such careful detail that it reads, 60 years later, less like a psychological study and more like a slow-motion account of how societies collapse. By the 3rd day, the Eagles had burned the Rattlers' flag. The Rattlers responded by raiding the Eagles' cabin while the Eagles were at the competition field, overturning cots, tearing personal belongings, scattering possessions across the floor. When eagles returned and saw what had been done to their things, not equipment, not shared resources, but the private objects they had brought from home, 3 boys were held back by staff from physical retaliation. That night, the rattlers went to sleep with socks filled with rocks beside their beds. If you've reached this point and you're feeling unsettled in a way that feels important, that feeling is the point. Subscribing to the Human Code means the next time we go somewhere like this, you'll be there. Sharif's notes from day 4 contain a detail that is easy to overlook and nearly impossible to forget once you have read it. The researchers had been carefully monitoring both groups' internal assessments of each other. They asked the boys at intervals to evaluate the performance of both groups on the competition tasks, not who they liked, but who was objectively better at the activities. By day 4, both groups were rating their own members as significantly more skilled, more athletic, and more capable than the other group across all tasks, including tasks in which the other group had objectively performed better. The boys were not lying. They believed their assessments. Their perception of reality had reorganized itself around the boundary between groups. This is the mechanism that Sharif had been looking for. Not aggression, not resource competition, perception itself. The way membership in a group does not merely change how you feel about outsiders, but changes what you see when you look at them. The eagles could watch a rattler complete an obstacle course faster than any eagle had completed it, and process that information as a confirmation of rattler inferiority through some combination of dismissal reframing and selective memory that happened automatically, without conscious distortion, without any intent to deceive. You do this, not occasionally, not under extreme provocation, routinely. The research on in-group favoritism in perception is among the most replicated findings in social psychology. People do not need months of conflict, do not need flag burnings or cabin raids to begin rating their own group's performance as superior. Studies using groups assembled in a laboratory 20 minutes before testing show the same basic effect. The boundary alone is sufficient. The moment you are assigned to a group, your brain begins reorganizing its assessments of performance, competence, and worth in ways that favor the members of your group and subtly disadvantage the members of theirs. And you will not notice it happening because it does not feel like bias. It feels like accurate perception. The third phase of the Robber's Cave experiment is the one that appears in textbooks as the resolution, the hopeful part, the part that demonstrates that conflict between groups can be reduced through cooperative effort towards shared goals. Sharif called these superordinate goals. He engineered a series of crises at the camp that required both groups to work together to solve: a water supply failure that turned out to have been deliberately created by staff, a truck that needed to be pulled from a ditch using a tug-of-war rope with both groups pulling in the same direction, a food supply problem that meant both groups went hungry unless they collaborated on a solution. The idea was that shared necessity would override group boundaries, that working alongside someone toward a common problem would dissolve the categories that made them an enemy. It worked. Partially. Slowly. Slowly. After multiple cooperative tasks over several days, the hostility began to reduce. Boys who had threatened each other with rock-filled socks began eating meals at the same table. Friendships, genuine ones, documented in follow-up surveys months later, formed across the group boundary. On the bus home at the end of camp, the eagles and the rattlers sat mixed together. A rattler used his own $5 prize money to buy malted milks for the whole bus, eagles included, because the malted milk stop only had enough for one group, and he didn't want anyone left out. This is the version of the story that gets taught, and it is true, but there is a part of the Robber's Cave findings that does not appear in most textbook summaries, and that Sharif himself spent relatively little time discussing. The superordinate goals worked in the context of a controlled camp environment with adult researchers managing every variable. When scholars attempted to apply the same principles in real-world intergroup conflicts, in desegregating schools, in post-conflict communities, in workplaces with entrenched group divisions, the results were substantially more complicated. Contact and cooperation reduced hostility in some cases. In others, it had no effect. In a significant number of documented cases, it made things worse, because bringing groups into close contact under conditions of unequal status, or where the cooperation felt coerced rather than genuine, did not dissolve the perception of difference, it crystallized it. What Sharif had found in the clean laboratory of a summer camp required conditions that real societies rarely provide: equal status contact, genuine shared stakes, cooperative rather than competitive structure, and sustained duration. Remove any one of those variables and the effect diminishes or reverses, which means that the hopeful part of the Robber's Cave story is not a prescription. It is a set of conditions, most of which are extraordinarily difficult to engineer in the actual social environments where group conflict takes root and hardens. The boys went home in late June 1954. They were debriefed incompletely by modern standards. Their parents were told they had had a wonderful camp experience. Sharif published his findings the following year, and the study entered the canon of social psychology as one of the foundational demonstrations of realistic conflict theory. The idea that group hostility arises naturally from competition over limited resources and can be reduced through cooperative interdependence. What it also demonstrated, in the part that gets less attention, is that the capacity for that hostility does not require any deficit in the individuals involved. The Eagles and the Rattlers were the healthiest, most well-adjusted boys the researchers could find. They came from stable homes. They had no prior history of aggression. They were selected specifically to rule out individual psychology as an explanation. What happened to them at Robber's Cave was not a product of who they were. It was a product of a structure, a set of conditions that human beings, any human beings, respond to in predictable ways because those responses are not learned behaviors. They are evolved ones. For most of human evolutionary history, the in-group and the out-group were not abstract categories. They were the difference between people who would share resources with you in winter and people who might compete for the same resources, the same territory, the same water supply. The brain's rapid formation of group loyalty, its automatic perceptual favoritism toward in-group members, its capacity to generate hostility toward out-group members with remarkable speed. These are not failures of rationality or morality. They are a system that worked for a very long time in a world where the boundaries between groups mapped onto genuine survival stakes. The world has changed. The system has not. And this is where the question lands on you, specifically. Not on the boys in Oklahoma in 1954. On the groups you currently belong to, the political ones, the professional ones, the national ones, the ones organized around identity or belief or neighborhood or team. Think about the last time you evaluated the performance or credibility or motives of someone from an out-group, and ask yourself honestly, how much of that evaluation was based on what they actually did, and how much of it was based on the category they occupied before they did anything at all? You will not be able to answer that question cleanly. The research suggests that no one can. The perceptual reorganization that group membership produces is not accessible to introspection. It does not announce itself. It presents itself as clarity. The rattler who spent his prize money on malted milks for the whole bus did not become a different person in 3 weeks at a camp in Oklahoma. He was always capable of that generosity. What changed was not his character. What changed was the structure around him. Here is what that means. The distance between the boy who filled a sock with rocks and the boy who bought melted milks for strangers is not a measure of moral development. It is a measure of conditions. And conditions can be changed. Is there a group you currently see as an outgroup, politically, professionally, socially, where if you are honest with yourself, your perception of their competence, their motives, or their basic good faith has been shaped less by their actual behavior and more by the fact that they are on the other side of a boundary you did not entirely choose to draw?